Greetings and good Thursday morning, the 8th of December 2022. It's a day after Pearl Harbor Day. That's 81 years ago yesterday that Pearl Harbor was attacked. And ironically enough, for those history buffs, not ironically, for those who study history, December 8th is also the day that Guam was attacked and inhabited by the Japanese Imperial Forces. Part of the reason I always establish the date / timeline is if you're new to my channel for any reason, I always like to expose where we're at as far as, hey, it's December 8th, 2022, third decade of the 21st century, and compare and contrast to what sort of things we're talking about, what's in the zeitgeist, as opposed to where people predicted or hypothesized where we would be. The other thing I like to do is I like to read, react, and respond to comments on my channel. Sometimes it kind of creates a bit of a loop, and it just is what it is. So sometimes my videos will say RR and R and then a date. Like this one will probably be stamped RR and R, read, react, and respond, and then today's date. Sorry about that. So without further ado, one of my one and only loyal viewers that takes the time to respond due to perhaps what's going on in their life. I know a few others take the time to watch my videos, but not everybody has the opportunity to respond, or perhaps what I'm talking about doesn't really hit them hard enough to where they feel the need to respond. But without further ado, Stace Catalin, my one loyal viewer that does take the time to respond, responded to my previous video in which she wrote, "I view my family being my hubby and my friends. I had an estranged relationship with my biological father, and that has carried on to the non-existent relationship with my half-brother. My stepdad was disowned by his father for marrying my mother, who had not only been married before, but also had a child out of that relationship. I had been closer to my stepdad's side of the family, those that didn't have to accept me. Granted, my favorite aunt had made a racist slur in the last conversation with her. So I find more comfort with my friends and my hubby than with my biological family members. While it feels like my mom and dad would go to church on Easter and Christmas, religion is still important to them. It was harder to come out as an atheist than it was to tell my family that I'm bisexual. The reason why I feel like I can have a somewhat open conversation on body dysmorphia is because I believe that you have never experienced it. Most of my friends who are trans will correct pronouns, but only as a way to teach or reach out as an educational opportunity. I cannot speak on behalf of them, but from what I witnessed in the past. Living in the South, there is an understanding of the upbringing using sir and ma'am, etc. So there is an understanding that the wrong pronoun could be used accidentally, or at least from what I've seen. As far as the Q Club, there has been interviews with the father who was more concerned that his son, the shooter, was gay. As long as the kid wasn't gay, the father was happy. So to add to his already mental state, there was the hatred taught to him against homosexuals. The kid's lawyers are claiming that the shooter identifies as non-binary. There should always be a safe haven, in my opinion. Let me double check something here real quick. Okay, I just wanted to confirm that we're not doubling up and that I didn't previously make a video and didn't get around to publish it. Yeah, that Club Q thing. Here's what I want to say on this particular subject. The one thing that I really enjoy about this particular channel, it's not the popularity or the lack of popularity. It's the opportunity to have a conversation with somebody that I don't see eye to eye with, and that neither one of us feel the desperate need to humiliate, criticize, put down, denigrate, dehumanize, demonize. You know, we recognize that we can see the world differently, that we can feel differently about different things, that different concepts can carry a level of weight and importance with us that may not be shared by others, but it doesn't make them bad people, and we don't have to go out of our way to tell them how bad we think they really are. And I think part of the reason I always bring up the time, and I always like to mention third decade of the 21st century as to compare where we are, where people predicted us to be, is because we've reached a point in the culture right now where people do feel the need to dehumanize and demonize and this whole cancel culture mentality. And why? Is it because of the internet? Does the internet really give us greater access to information that was previously agreed upon as inappropriate topics of conversation? You know, I'm sure Stace and I are old enough to remember when the original theme was you never talk religion and politics because they're very divisive. And then Gabriel Iglesias went as far as saying sports as well, because sports can tend to be very divisive, where some people have really invested a lot in professional sports teams. So he's like, those are very sensitive topics and I choose to stay away from them. The point that I try to stress on this channel, and whether I have one viewer or many, is that it doesn't matter. You know, part of the thing that makes our country great is the ability to basically do you. Now, I think some people abuse that, and I'm going to leave it at that. If you want me to qualify it, I think some people take advantage of the freedoms we have to be who they are, but then they equally demand that others accept them. Now, granted, they may gather in groups, also known as echo chambers, where they reinforce each other with like-minded people, but I think the biggest problem we face right now is the demand for acceptance, the demand for tolerance, the demand that everybody shares the same belief as you, to include on these various topics, that what's important to you must also be equally as important to somebody else. Case in point, and whether I'm directing this at you, Stace, or anybody else in general, some of the topics that Stace brought up don't carry weight or importance with me. So you're bisexual. So maybe you have gender dysmorphia. So maybe the pronoun issue is important to you. It's not to me, but that's fine. You do you. All right? Stace lives in a completely different state. We don't work together. We don't have any other impact on each other's lives, and I don't see why we need to. Other than this conversation and expressing our views and exchanging points of views with one another, at the end of the day, how does it actually affect me? And I wonder if anybody else takes that into consideration. So the pronoun thing is very important in the circles that Stace runs in. Who cares? It doesn't have to be important to me for me to leave it alone. So it's important to you. That's fine. You do you. As long as you accept that it's not as important to me, why do I need to go out of my way to convince you that you should feel this way? Just like, why should you go out of the way to convince me of this? Now, here's what I will say, Stace, and we don't have to agree on this. Your friends, even though you're stating that they're trying to educate, try to look at it from a different perspective. And I'm going to try to give you an example. I may fail in my endeavor, but try to work with me here. So imagine if, out of politeness, out of courtesy, out of decency and humanity, one of your friends who tries to educate others on pronouns and whatnot was to say, thank you for being a soldier, thank you for your service. And then I was like, well, hang on a second. Now I must steal some of your time and rob you from whatever you were doing to educate you now on what you did wrong. You see, I'm not a soldier. I didn't join the Army. I didn't go to Army Basic. I went to Marine boot camp and I earned the title of Marine. I'm a Marine. I'm not a soldier. I'm not an airman. I'm not a Coast Guardsman. I'm not a spaceman or whatever they're called. To your friend, that has no bearing. That has no meaning. It's like, I'm sorry, I don't understand the distinction. It's not an important part of my life. I was just trying to be kind and courteous. quite frankly, I've dealt with that a lot, where people, what's it like being a soldier? And it's like, well, and I've also had to come to terms with that too, where people are just trying to be kind and courteous. People are just trying to extend some humanity and some civility. And now I'm thinking I'm educating them on the differences, but in reality, there's like, oh, Jesus Christ, I was just trying to be nice and polite. Now you're turning it into this thing. I don't really care. I was just trying to be kind and humane and civil. And now you're really being a bit of an ass about it. And now I have a negative opinion about you. It's just an example. All right. I'm not saying the two things are necessarily the same, but for some people, depending on what they're going through, depending on what's happening at that point in time in their life, that's how it could come across. Well, now hang on a second, that's not exactly the pronoun I identify with. Roger that. It's important to you. It's an important concept to you. May not be important to others. At the end of the day, another way to look at it too is, well, look, I understand it's important to you. However, I've already spent enough time on this as I wanted to. If you really want to push the subject, it's going to start to cross over into the negative emotions. So why don't we just let bygones be bygones? Now here's the thing. Not everybody has to agree with that. But I think we've reached a point in our modern day society where, going back to this concept of labels and whatnot, where we don't want others to give us our labels, but we want to label ourselves. I think what's happening now is people are getting overly invested, emotionally invested, and some people, I'm not saying anybody you're friends with, Stace, although maybe they are people you're friends with, and same thing, the coin has two sides, all right? The same people I deal with. People that go out of their way to be offended. And all I can say is, as a person, I've had moments, I've had days, I've had instances where just whatever's going on in my life, that when something like that occurs, I've been the person, well, hang on a second, I'm not technically a soldier, I'm a Marine. And I potentially made a situation worse where there was no intent to insult, there was no intent to offend. Somebody was just trying to be courteous and civil, and because of whatever I was going through at that point in time, I escalated things. So I'd be very curious to hear your thoughts on that, whether we have any, if we share any views on that, or if you're like, no, I'm going to stick to my guns, and that's perfectly fine. That's all part of this whole you do you. And Stace, once again, if I don't say it enough, it's not just thank you for watching my video, but thank you for taking the time to respond. You talked about the Club Q thing. My apologies. I'm not tracking that 100%. I may have heard about it. But not to be a hypocrite, I'm a big fan of you do you. Now, if Club Q was an establishment strictly for a unique group of individuals, it should be a safe space, and there should be spaces like that. All right, I know in my 20s we used to be made aware of, hey, this club is for these people, so just know ahead of time if you're going to that club that's known for being this type of establishment. And good, bad, or indifferent, I think places like that should exist. I know here locally we have a couple of establishments that are that cater to people that are really into role-playing games. We have a club that doesn't have a fixed location, but they're really into live-action role-play. These are safe spaces for those people to indulge in that sort of an activity, free from persecution and whatnot. Whether they qualify as the same thing or not, my point is the same. You should be free to be who you are, as long as you're not trying to convert or influence others who are not looking to be influenced. And you should have a safe place to do that. Why people feel the need to act out upon it, I don't know. But I think what it does is going back to something I've said in the past, it's people who want to bring up guns as the issue, the gun is the tool. You're talking about somebody who more than likely has a mental health issue, and mental health is obviously the problem. As far as your family goes, good, bad, or indifferent, I had a bit of an estranged relationship that might have been why I gravitated more towards the military. I know for a fact it had a lot to do with why I stayed in the military as long as I did. Not trying to necessarily air out dirty laundry, but I have two half-sisters. So when my mom remarried for a second time to my second stepfather, he was probably the closest thing to a father figure I had outside of my uncle, my mom's brother. Not all of my stepfather's influences were positive in the moment, but the long overarching effects did have a positive impact. The appreciation of doing things right the first time, establishing habits to do things right the first time. I may not have appreciated the consequences when I was younger. Like, he would, if I didn't take the garbage out before it was brimming to the top, he would dump the garbage in my room, and sometimes he would dump the garbage on my bed, therefore forcing me to not only clean up the laundry or clean up the garbage, but if he dumped it on my bed, I would have to clean my bedding. I would have to do laundry. Same thing, if I put dishes in the sink and I didn't wash them, he would throw the dirty dishes in my room. He'd throw them on my bed. We don't have to agree that that was the right thing to do, but at the same time, in order to avoid that kind of, because he took advantage of the fact that I'd be at school. He used to work at night, so he would come home at like 2, 3, 4 in the morning, and one of the consequences was he slept like shit. So I used to get made fun of a lot because I would get up and I would go to school as early as possible just so that I got the fuck out of the house and didn't have to put up with him, because God forbid I made any kind of noise loud enough to disturb his sleep. If my mom had already left for work, then it was an opportunity for him to act out. And I think in high school, in between junior high and high school, our relationship had gotten so bad that he used to actively seek out opportunities to fuck with me. It just is what it is, all right? I can't not cover up for it. I cannot overlook it. It happened. However, conversely, whether you call it an appreciation or not, what I gathered from that was, all right, well, do your motherfucking dishes. You use a dish, clean the dish. He didn't have a problem with it being in the drying rack. He had a problem with a dirty dish being in the sink. Take out the motherfucking garbage. There's no reason why the garbage has to be overflowing and people are stacking garbage on top of garbage. Could my mom have said something? Yes, but she never did. So, yeah, I learned, take out the garbage. There's a lot of positive benefits to taking out the garbage before it's overflowing. Did he have to dump it in my bed? No, but I also learned to make my bed, because if my bed was at least made, he would dump the garbage on just the comforter, and as long as nothing was wet that seeped through, then I just had to wash the comforter. There's a million other examples I can get into, but at the end of the day, I kind of see where you're coming from. I had a bit of an estranged relationship. I've got two half-sisters. One of them actually lives down here. I don't see her like hardly ever. And the phone works both ways. I've reached out to her, but I think for the 20 years I was in the service and the few years I was retired before she moved down here, she's just so used to not having me available that she doesn't know how to operate with me being available. I'm not saying she's a bad person. I'm just saying her life patterns, her life behavior didn't include me. So now she doesn't know how to include me or my family. That's probably the most positive thing I could say. Anything else kind of gets towards the selfishness. Some of the things that I think were unique to you, I was born an Irish Catholic and I was baptized an Irish Catholic, but we never went to church. Church was not something we did. When my mom was married to her first husband, my first stepdad, I was forced to go to a Christian daycare where, well, it was a Christian kindergarten followed by daycare, where we were forced to do very Christian things. And I just remember it just left a bad impression upon me. So I don't know if I'd call us atheists. But we sure as hell weren't casual Christians. Religion was not a big part of our upbringing. But we also grew up in what I suppose you would call the North. I grew up in Chicago, where we didn't really call ourselves the North. At best, we probably considered ourselves Midwest, but we never considered ourselves anything other than that. We didn't feel like the sense of pride that some people do from being from Texas or being part of the South or whatever the case may be. Religion wasn't a big factor in our house, but I can certainly see how who you are as an individual human being, if your individuality conflicts with the church, I can see how that's a big issue. And I'm sorry as hell you have that relationship, but sometimes it's like you said, your family doesn't have to end in blood. Your family can be who you surround yourself with. Your family can be your husband. It can be your close personal friends. Sometimes blood relatives are not good for us. You know, they're toxic. I've got a good relationship with my uncle. I had a good relationship with my grandmother. I eventually had a good relationship with my stepfather when I no longer lived under his roof. Part of that was because between him and my in-laws, they weren't my in-laws back then, but they are now. A lot of people were betting against me to not make it through boot camp. Joke's on them. Boot camp's actually quite easy to make it through. You just got to shut up and do what you're told. But a lot of them were betting against me. So that motivated me to do this Marine thing. But I also understand where if your family's very spiteful towards you, it makes you spiteful towards them. Like I said, family doesn't have to end in blood. You can make your family whoever you want. And I've learned to do that as well. Stace, I'm going to go in a different direction. And I look forward to you commenting on any of the stuff I've said. But maybe in the next 10 to 15 minutes, God, hopefully less than that, I'm going to put something else out there. And anybody else watching this, please feel free to comment. But Stace, since I feel confident you're going to watch and respond, I'm going to put this out there to you specifically. And anybody else is welcome to comment. At the risk of giving out too much information, here's what I'll say. My wife, for the better part of 4 years, has worked in the educational system, specifically with exceptional needs children. It's my personal estimation that once we began to destigmatize mental health, whether it was autism, ADHD, whatever the case may be, and whether part of that is because of talk television that a lot of soccer moms watched in the mid to late 90s, early 2000s, whatever the case may be, there are some positives to destigmatizing mental issues, mental illness, whatever the case may be. The problem is it goes to what I talked about before. In America, we don't do things in moderation. We do things to excess. Stace, I know you've said that you've got a background in education, whether you were an educator or your degree is in education. So part of the reason is I'm addressing this to you. Part of our daily routine is my wife and I I'll call her on my way home from work because I got about a 15-minute drive and I just love to listen to her talk about her day. Some of the kids she deals with, it's my personal estimation that there's nothing really wrong with them. A mental health professional, in order to validate their existence, may go out of their way to provide a diagnosis, but from some of the stuff I hear, there's not that much wrong with some of these kids, that there's been this overwhelming desire to just diagnose the hell out of everything and medicate or treat, when in all actuality, it's my personal opinion that some of these kids just lack discipline. And this is where it becomes the self-licking ice cream cone. From some of the stuff I hear, all right, and I don't want to incriminate anybody or give out any names, but some of the stuff I hear, the parents are using the schools as a glorified babysitter or free daycare. So they're leaning heavily on the educational system to basically watch their kids for roughly 6 hours a day before they have to deal with them. They're also hoping, in some way, shape, or form, that the school system will enforce a level of discipline that apparently they're not willing to enforce at home. Here's the catch-22, the self-licking ice cream cone. Now, Stace, hopefully you'll find the humor in this, because I mean it sarcastically. Too many Karens, all right, and regardless of skin complexion, ethnicity, whatever the case may be, too many Karens got involved and complained that the schools were doing things that they found to be inappropriate. Therefore, the schools have equally had to react and respond by pulling farther and farther back. And I listened to this from my wife as far as what they can and can't do, specifically what they can't do. Basically, all they can do is document, but they are not physically responsible for the child's discipline, to include, whether anybody agrees or disagrees, with physical discipline. Essentially, the concept of actions have consequences. Now, ironically enough, I learned this at the Ronald McDonald House, where apparently somebody reported me for spanking my daughter. They reported me to the Ronald McDonald House staff for spanking my daughter. And they brought me in and they're like, yeah, Mr. Blackwell, we understand that somebody witnessed you committing corporal punishment. And I was like, what the fuck? I didn't say that, but I was like, what the fuck are you talking about? If somebody said that you had spanked your daughter, we don't condone that level of behavior. And I was like, oh, I'm sorry, pardon me, but in all honesty, what business is it of yours how I'm raising my children? Unless I am physically abusing my daughter, and anybody and everybody with an ounce of common sense can go, oh yeah, that shit's wrong. What business is it of anybody's, especially yours, how I discipline my daughter when she's wrong? Well, it was brought to our... It's like, can you just answer the question? It's like, and finally they just broke down and they're like, look, I understand you spanked your child, which a spanking is a spanking. We've had people here before that go beyond spanking. So unfortunately, without... It ties our hands. Without trying to come up with a scale of what's a spanking versus what is a physical beating, the policy is basically no touching. And I was like, okay. I was like, look, I get it. You got a job to do. I understand. I appreciate that. I was like, I'm just more upset of the fact that I come here to mind my own business. Why does anybody else mind their own? I was like, apparently I've upset somebody to the point where they're like, yeah, apparently, because they've complained about you several times. This is the first time we're saying anything, and we're only saying it to make them happy, because they strike us as the type of people that like to make a scene. So if anything, can you just say that we've had this conversation? And I was like, yes, just so you know ahead of time, I'm a very, very aggressive person, and I'm the type of person to go up to these people and be like, hey, let's deal with this. I mean, let's really deal with this. You feel so strongly about your convictions, let's fight for who's right. I mean, let's physically fight over who's right. If you beat my ass, you're right. Your opinion's better than mine. If I beat your ass, my opinion's better than yours. And they're like, Mr. Black, we'd appreciate it if you didn't do that. And I was like, okay. I was like, well, I'll tell you what. From what I've observed of these people, it won't be too long before they actually break the law. So I'll just keep my mouth shut until they fuck up that bad. And sure as shit, they did. I won't get into specifics, but basically it had something to do with child endangerment and child abandonment. So yeah, I did not hesitate to call the authorities. Fuck with me? Oh no! I fuck back worse. But I digress. Back to my wife, back to the educational system. My estimation is that a lot of parents are relying on the educational system to provide the discipline that they're not providing at home, all the while not understanding or appreciating because of other parents, to include possibly parents like themselves, complaining that the schools did more than what they found acceptable. Schools don't do that anymore. Schools do not discipline children other than, hey, don't do that. And if you violate the rules to a certain extent, the discipline is you're sent home. You're not allowed to come to school. Where I'm left with is some of the stuff I hear from my wife, and nobody's inclined to agree with this. I'm exercising my right to my own personal opinion. Some of these kids just need an old-fashioned ass whooping. They've been living in a world, however briefly they've been on this earth, they've been living in a world free of consequence. A timeout is not a consequence. Going to your room is not a consequence. You give a kid a 5-minute timeout, you need to enforce it. It has to have meaning. You send a kid to their room, that has to have meaning. I send my kids to their room, they have computers, televisions, video game systems. That's a fucking privilege. All right? So we have an entire generation of kids who are probably already reaching adulthood. We probably have a generation of young adults who grew up in the past decade or so with an extreme lack of consequence. All because a handful of people went above and beyond to what was considered decent, what was considered acceptable, and we overcorrected. And now, because we overcorrected, we have an entire generation of parents not instituting consequences. We have an entire generation of individuals growing up without consequences. And it sounds like my wife deals with a lot of individuals who do not have consequences, and the parents are hoping that the school will provide the consequences they're not willing to do. And it doesn't work that way. You've basically taken that privilege or that right or that ability away from the school. You need to do it for yourself. Some of these kids my wife deals with are little assholes that need to get their asses whooped. You know, a good spanking. You know, they need to have a good sense of fear instilled in them that if they fuck up, there's a consequence. I don't care how many psychological studies have been done. I don't care how much research has been done. I don't care how many serial killers that were talked to in prison that, well, if their dad would have just loved them some more. You know what? No, at the end of the day, you were probably a fucked up individual to begin with, and you were set on that path long before your dad either did or did not love you. It just is what it is. That's my personal opinion. Nobody's inclined to agree with it. But hey, let me know what you think. I'm just trying to encourage discussion. All right, on the previous topics I discussed or on this one, does anybody feel as though there's a generation of kids and young adults who have grown up in an environment where there was a severe lack of consequence? All right, I'll go one step further. Organized sports. Everybody's a winner. Everybody's special. Everybody's good. No, when I grew up, there were winners and losers. If your team sucked, it's because you sucked. Either you did not possess the requisite amount of talent and just innate skill level to compete, or you did, and you were rewarded for it, or you worked together as a team and you were rewarded for it. Now it's like everybody's special. It helps boost their egos, and then they get to a, you know, most modern businesses enforce consequences. If you suck, you're fired. And I think we have a young generation of individuals who are already in adulthood that suck, and another generation right behind them that suck. And what really upsets me is I watch it in the military. Because the military is governed by elected officials who are elected by a bunch of fucking Karens, and they're pussifying the fucking military. But that's just my opinion. I'd love to hear from you. I've been ranting for about 34 minutes, so I'm going to try to end this before I hit 35. Here's the deal. I'm a big fan of you do you, and I'll leave you alone. I'll do me, you leave me alone. But also, I don't want to dehumanize others. I don't want to adversely affect others. I just want to increase conversation and see if we're better than red versus blue, blue versus red. That's all I'm trying to do. So, if you've made it this far, please leave a comment. I'd love to hear from you and increase this conversation. Stace, I'm really looking forward to your comments. even if we don't agree. I really enjoy having the conversation with you in this format, if for no other reason than because we do disagree, but we disagree in what I think is a very civil and humane manner, and neither one of us is trying to belittle the other one. It's like, I see things differently. Cool. Good for you. You're still a good person. So, with that being said, Stace, I look forward to your comments. Anybody else, if you get involved and leave a comment, I really appreciate it, and you're awesome. Until next time.